Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. I remember when my mother retired, she had a gathering of friends and family to celebrate. Her pastor at the time was invited and was supposed to offer prayer. I have remembered what he said ever since. He began by talking about the kind of watch he preferred. He said he didn't like digital watches for himself, the kind that show numbers to reflect the time. Instead, he admitted that he liked the old analog watches with a dial and hands, and in particular, he liked a watch with a second hand. With a second hand, he said, he was able to see the sweep of time. Then he talked about my mother's career, that we were there to celebrate the sweep of time. And then part of his prayer included thanking God for the gift of time. As we continue our introduction to the 5 minor prophets at the very end of the Old Testament, it's a good idea to keep the sweep of time through much of the Bible story. You see, following King Solomon, the nation of Israel split into 2 nations. The nation in the north kept the name Israel, and the nation in the south was known as Judah. For quite a while, the Bible follows both these nations, listing who was king of each one and whether they were a good king who followed God's ways or not. There were many who were not good kings, who sought after other gods or who forsook caring for the people they were king over. But one stands out as an especially good king. King Josiah in Judah repudiated his ancestors who had abandoned God, and then instituted many reforms to encourage people back to faith. Most scholars think that the prophet we will consider today preached during the time of Josiah, probably just before his reforms took place. Zephaniah is not a book of prophecy that we look to often. As I mentioned, this week we are looking at 5 of the minor prophets, and in particular at the last 5 in the Old Testament, and getting a brief introduction to them. Zephaniah preached about the same time as Jeremiah, most likely somewhere around 630 BC. While we don't know much about Zephaniah personally, there are some things that are suspected about who he was. First, Zephaniah seems to know the city of Jerusalem very, very well, which to some suggests that he was part of a royal family. This idea is supported by 2 other observations. First, Zephaniah never speaks against the king, which you might expect from a member of the royal family. And second, in his prophecy, there is the complete absence of any concern for the poor. Also what you might expect from a member of the upper class. This last, absence of concern for the poor, is pretty unusual among the prophets. Almost universally, biblical prophets understand and see that God calls people to care for the poor and outcast, and their failure to do that is one of the chief marks of how the rulers and the people have forsaken God. Somehow, that's not a concern for Zephaniah. He does have concerns, however, and the main one is something called religious syncretism. We might describe syncretism as the watering down or blending of religious belief. Syncretism might be described by people who take a little of this religion or a little of that one and blend them together, saying that there's truth in all of them. The thing is, when we do that, we end up believing and following only what is comfortable for us. And in essence, we end up creating God in our image. Zephaniah knew that God had called God's people to be distinctive in their faith. They were to follow God and follow God fervently and completely. They were to follow God only and not water down their faith to what was comfortable or what they thought. So Zephaniah railed about this, telling the people that if they didn't come back to true faith in God, then the destructive day of the Lord was upon them. By the way, it turned out that Zephaniah was right. About 35 years after Zephaniah preached, Babylon came and destroyed Jerusalem and took the people into exile, events that were interpreted as God's judgment to call people back to true faith. Now, Zephaniah does spend some time prophesying to other nations about divine judgment as well for how they aren't following God, and he ends up his book with some words of comfort and consolation for those who do wait patiently for God and serve God with one accord. Nevertheless, Zephaniah's words about religious syncretism might be a message that we need to hear today, and perhaps we ought to ask ourselves how we have accommodated our faith to society, to other ideas about religion, to faith that is comfortable and easy. We might ask how we may have created a God in our image so that we get along with God better. We might ask ourselves if we are fervently following God as we should. As our time sweeps along, Zephaniah calls us back to true faith. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.